Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy and it's Friday the 19th of May. I'm pleased to say that we're joined this evening by William Duguid. William, hello, good evening, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you
Nice to be
for,
back.
yeah, thank you for joining us again. So William, I should have given you a proper intro. So you're a regular contributor here to Shows and Broadcasting Scotland and you're an activist mainly with Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. Um,
That's right.
Yeah, I was hoping to bump into you at the recent march, but I didn't spot you. Maybe you saw me first and then hid behind a placard or something. Or...
Oh, I was hiding from quite a lot of people, so it's perfectly possible, but I don't think you were one of them, Brian. It's okay.
Okay, so I'll start then with tonight's routine, usual Ukraine update, and today we're on day 450. Ukrainian air defence has claimed it destroyed 19 drones and missiles out of 28 launched this morning. Three Caliber missiles launched from the Black Sea and 16 drones were shot down. Shelling continues on an almost daily basis. Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson Yuri Inat told Ukrainian television. Vladimir Zelensky has addressed Arab League leaders in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. In a speech today, Vladimir Putin has said the West is trying to break up Russia into different states based on ethnic and national lines. Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev has claimed that the US was involved in the killing of a pro-war military blogger in a bomb blast in St. Petersburg in April and the car bombing of a nationalist writer and politician earlier in May. 5 members of the Belarusian regiment fighting with Ukrainian forces have been killed in the flashpoint East Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. The United States and the rest of the G7 major economies will unveil new sanctions and export controls targeting Russia, a US official has said ahead of the G7 summit in Japan. The G7's latest efforts were aimed at disrupting Russia's ability to get materials it needed for the battlefield, closing loopholes used to evade sanctions, further reducing international reliance on Russian energy, and narrowing Moscow's access to the international financial system. The UK unveiled a swathe of new sanctions ahead of the meeting, including a ban on UK imports of Russian diamonds and Russian origin copper, nickel, and aluminium. A judge will decide today whether Jacques Teixeira, accused of leaking highly classified military documents, including sensitive information about the war in Ukraine, will remain behind bars pending trial. Pentagon overestimated the value of the ammunition, missiles and other equipment it sent to Ukraine by about $3 billion, according to a Senate aide and a defense official. The error may result in more weapons to be sent to Ukraine. Ukraine has used the long-range Storm Shadow missiles provided by the UK, Defence Minister Ben Wallace said. Ukraine said it had repelled a day of Russian attacks in and around the ruined eastern city of Bakhmut on Thursday and made gains of a kilometre in some places while buying time for certain planned actions. The Russian Defence Ministry has claimed it struck Ukrainian military targets using high-precision missiles. The Black Sea grain corridor, designed to ensure the safe supply of Ukrainian food to world markets, has not yet resumed operation, despite agreement to extend the deal for 2 months on Wednesday. So, William, that's today's daily update. Was there anything in there that caught your eye?
Well, a couple of things. I am interested in the food supply issue, and really, we need to see the Black Sea grain deal working out because that's a long-term problem for all of us, and that needs to move forward. The other thing I think that was perhaps interesting was that Zelensky was in Jeddah today talking to Saudi Arabia. And the signs I was seeing and what I was reading about it, and this is just me reading The Guardian like anybody else, is that Saudi Arabia seems to have moved from a position of favouring Russia to pretty well neutrality. So that can be seen, I think, as one reward for Zelensky and his diplomatic initiatives from this week. And I suspect we will see some more of these as the next wee while progresses. and we maybe get towards the famous counteroffensive that we're hoping to see quite soon.
Potential chink of light there then. I'm sure if that does materialise, we'll be hearing about it, and we'll give you due credit for that if and when it does materialise. Fingers crossed.
Yep.
So our first item this evening, or technically the second item, forgive me. G7 leaders have laid flowers at a memorial to the victims of the US atomic bombing of Hiroshima in a sombre opening to a summit overshadowed by fears of potential nuclear conflict in Ukraine. As the heavy, as the heavy early morning rain began to ease, the summit's host, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and his wife Yuko welcomed leaders and their spouses at the entrance to the city's Peace Memorial Museum, where they viewed graphic reminders of the attack on the city on the 6th of August 1945 and its gruesome aftermath. In the meetings today, the G7 unveiled further sanctions targeting Russia over its war against Ukraine, as Volodymyr Zelensky prepared to attend the Hiroshima summit in person. Our support for Ukraine will not waver, the G7 leaders said in a statement on Friday, vowing to stand together against Russia's illegal, unjustifiable and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia started this war and can end this war, they said. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was top of the agenda as G7 leaders gathered in Hiroshima, with Friday's statement designed to underscore their resolve to support Ukraine and put pressure on Moscow. The statement said, 15 months of Russian aggression has cost thousands of lives, inflicted immense suffering on the people of Ukraine, and imperiled access to food and energy for many of the world's most vulnerable people. We urge Russia to stop its ongoing aggression and immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw its troops and military equipment from the entire internationally recognised territory of Ukraine. The sanctions are designed to disrupt the Kremlin's ability to get the materials it needs for the battlefield, close loopholes used to evade sanctions, further reduce international reliance on Russian energy, and narrow Moscow's access to the international financial system. The G7 countries reiterated their call on other countries to immediately stop providing material support to Russia's aggression or face severe costs. President Zelensky is expected to arrive in Hiroshima on Saturday from Saudi Arabia, where he was attending the Arab League summit, and take part in talks the following day. So, William, it seems that these steps to sorry, forgive me, I'll cut ahead through some of my notes. The thing that struck me when I was preparing for this item tonight was that quite sombre ceremony outside the museum to the world's first use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima, and the wreaths that they laid at the site, and yet at the same time there's fears of nuclear conflict in Ukraine. Just some figures: the world's first nuclear attack, 60 to 80,000 people died instantly, and 140,000 died later due to radiation or burns, etc. And by the end of the year, the total toll was, or ever since then, apparently the figure is, and it's quite an exact one, 333,907 people are believed to have died as a result of the nuclear attack on Hiroshima. Out of the G7 nations, 3 of them have nuclear weapons. President Biden's the second president to visit after Obama, and Rishi Sunak is the first prime minister to visit Hiroshima ever, which I was surprised at. And it just seemed to me that in this, the G7 say that their aim is to have a world without nuclear weapons, but we Scots already know that Westminster is pretty much wedded to Trident. Is there an element of hypocrisy there?
I think there's always an element of hypocrisy when you're dealing with nuclear nations, because Hiroshima was chosen as a symbolic location, I'm sure, to try and say, let's never do this again. But of course, if you have a deterrent of that nature, then the deterrent is always capable of being used. And I suppose that is just realpolitik. I don't think there's any prospect in the near future of a real reversal of nuclear proliferation. And there are undertones to the whole Ukraine conflict that there is always just a possibility of it degenerating into a nuclear exchange, particularly if things don't necessarily go the way of Russia. So um, it is symbolic, but what it symbolizes is up to each individual to decide. I think it almost hints at being a little bit ominous. So we shall just have to wait and see what happens.
Okay, thank you, William. Our next item. John Allen will stand down as chair of Tesco after allegations of inappropriate behaviour. Allen, who has been chair of the UK's biggest supermarket since 2015, will step down at the retailer's annual general meeting on the 16th of June. The announcement came on Friday, 10 days after it was reported that Allen allegedly touched the bottom of a senior member of Tesco staff in June 2022 at the company's last AGM. In a statement, Tesco said it had conducted an extensive review into the allegation relating to the annual meeting, but had not identified any evidence or complaints against Allen. Byron Grote, the senior independent director at Tesco, said, "While we have received no complaints about John's conduct and made no findings of wrongdoing, these allegations risk becoming a distraction to Tesco." Allen said the allegations were utterly baseless and that I remain determined to prove my innocence. 4 allegations about Allen emerged during the Guardian's investigation into the Confederation of British Industry, or CBI, the UK's foremost business lobbying group. Allen was president of the organisation between 2018 and 2020, and then vice president until October 2021. He has denied 3 of the 4 claims made against him. So, William, John Allen, he's a prominent business leader. He claims he's innocent. Tesco say there's no evidence, and yet there's 4 allegations from his time at the CBI. And there's also been reports of inappropriate remarks that he's made to women. He admitted making a comment about a CBI staffer's appearance and actually apologised for that at one point. So there does seem to be, I don't know, no smoke without fire. But I just wanted to bring up, I don't know if you remember, there was a police video Scotland a couple of years ago. Yes, and the voice in my ear is saying that we did say in the report that all of this is allegedly, and
Yeah.
time will tell. But do you remember there was a police video Scotland, a Police Scotland video of last year, I think it was, called "Don't Be That Guy," because which it's a campaign to tackle sexual violence. Now, I don't think anybody's actually accused Alan of sexual violence, but the video starts off very low key, with men speaking directly to camera, saying things like, "Have you ever called a girl doll?" Or "Have you ever wolf whistled at a woman?" Or "Have you ever stared at a woman on a bus?" Or told a mate that "I do that," or "Have you ever taken a woman for dinner or paid for the meal and then expected that she owed you something?" And the tagline by the end of the video is, "Sexual violence starts long before you think it does." I haven't seen it for quite some time, that Police Scotland video, and it was applauded at the time. But do you think we should be playing it more often, maybe in schools and on television or social media? It just seems to have
Yeah.
disappeared.
Yeah, I think it's very important to learn the lesson that it's not just the big things that matter, but possibly the little things that either might lead to them later or might just make people feel uncomfortable and insecure. And we're a lot more attuned to that than we ever were in the days when perhaps when John Allen was much younger, he was coming up through the business. I've got to be fair to John Allen and say they have looked for evidence and they haven't really found anything. So it may just be that he's been unlucky enough to be alive in an era when everybody is looking at that, particularly with the CBI. And it is also noticeable that he's not leaving with immediate effect, but that he's going at the next AGM on June the 16th. So I think it is good that we ask our business leaders, like all our leaders, to have the very highest standards of behaviour. And that does mean they have to be careful. And maybe slowly they will begin to learn that. And it would be helped, yes, if the very good films that can be shown to folk when they are a wee bit younger continue to be shown, and that they maybe just pick up better habits from the very start.
Yes, and also I meant to start this item with just a little reminder that we're two men of a certain age. It would have been good if we could have had maybe a second guest, a female guest, to offer some kind of perhaps more relevant contribution. But I'll move on to.
Oh, I'll be as relevant as I can. But yes.
Yeah, I struggle to be relevant though, I must admit personally, but that's just me. So I'll move on to the next item. Household energy bills could fall to an average of £2,053 a year this summer as the regulator prepares to lower its cap on energy prices next week, according to analysts. However, campaigners have warned that the lower cap on energy bills, to be announced on Thursday, is unlikely to provide much relief to households that struggled to pay their bills over the winter because the government's support schemes have come to an end. Households should also expect their energy bills to remain stubbornly high through the coming winter, at almost double the rates paid in 2020, and remain above pre-pandemic levels for the rest of the decade, according to analysts at Cornwall Insight. The government's energy price guarantee capped gas and electricity bills at an average of £2,500 for a typical household from October last year. Energy bill payers also received a £400 rebate spread over 6 months from October, which helped reduce costs further. From July this year, the standard energy tariffs used by 27 million households will once again be decided by a cap calculated by Ofgem, the energy regulator for Great Britain, which is based on the cost of supplying energy. Cornwall Insight has predicted that Ofgem's cap will fall by more than £1,000 from £3,280 for the 3 months from April, when households were still protected by the government scheme, to £2,053 from July to reflect the tumbling cost of gas in the global wholesale markets. The price cap is expected to remain at similar levels next winter too, according to Cornwall's analysts. They have predicted that the cap will dip slightly to £1,975 for the 3 months from October, before rising again to reach almost £2,045 for the first quarter of next year. Campaigners from the End Fuel Poverty Coalition have warned that households hoping for a sharp drop in their bills may find little difference compared with the rates they paid over the winter. William, I think the gist of that piece is that it seems that fuel prices will be coming down in the summer months when people maybe don't need to put on their central heating or their electric fires as much, and it's going to go up again when things get colder. And then, as we heard, Westminster government support's already come to an end. I tried to find out what the Scottish government has tried to do to mitigate the energy crisis, and £150 million of council tax payments reached 73% of Scottish households, which, although not for energy, that's bound to have helped. And then there was the Scottish Government tripled support for people struggling with energy bills. That was First Minister Humza Yousaf. In his first act, he increased support for households struggling with rising energy costs. He went beyond the SNP Scottish Government's commitment to double the Fuel Insecurity Fund, tripled it to £30 million when previously it was at the £10 million Fuel Insecurity Fund. And yet, I keep hearing that the cost of gas in the global wholesale market is falling, but we're not seeing that reflected in our bills. Are you surprised at that?
I still think there is probably some profiteering going on. The wholesale cost of gas is coming right down, and the adjustment of the cap does not, in my view, fully reflect that. So that's a wee bit troubling. And it's also slightly annoying to see the good news of the average price coming down being offset by the removal of government support from Westminster. So it's all a bit of a wash. And of course, anything that the Scottish Government can do to alleviate that is a good thing. But it simply still means that people are dealing with energy costs roughly twice what they were experiencing before the pandemic, with every prospect that they'll continue at fairly high levels for some time to come. And when you sort of weigh that in with everything else, it's a steady drain on household income and their ability to support themselves. And that has all forms of knock-on effect on the rest of the economy. So I think it's a fundamentally broken market. And I think that we really, really need to look at decoupling the price of energy from the price of gas and better reflecting the actual mode of generation. If a formula could be found to do that, I think a lot of our problems would be far distant.
So do you think it's that word mitigation again that we hear all too often when it comes to Scotland and Westminster, or the Scottish Government in
It's all it,
Westminster?
yeah. I mean, mitigation basically, in so many cases, is all the Scottish government have. It's all they can do, and it's good to see it happen, but it can't do anything more than make a small impact on the problem. And the fundamentals of the problem need to be addressed, and that isn't down to the Scottish government.
Yes, and I think maybe the last thing we should say before we leave this item is that Scotland is an energy-rich nation. Yeah.
Very much so. We'll be saying that in our street stall tomorrow.
Well, good. Good luck with that then. We can hear about it maybe next time you're on.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the next item. The rising cost of food will overtake the price of energy as the driving force behind inflation over the summer, hitting poorer households the hardest, and a leading think tank has forecast. Grocery bills that had rocketed by almost 20% during the past year would continue to increase, replacing energy prices that were expected to begin falling over the next few months, the Resolution Foundation has said. The think tank said it was not clear that politicians were prepared for another year of food price rises, or that policy debates have caught up with the scale of what is going on. Official figures released next Wednesday are predicted to show that the annual rate of inflation fell in April by about 2 percentage points from the 10.1% figure for March. The drop to single digits will be a relief for households and businesses that have come under intense financial pressure from rising prices. However, the pace of decline is expected to slow as firms push up the price of food. Food prices usually fall in the summer as UK crops replace more expensive imports. But factory gate prices for milk, meat and other foods has accelerated, in some cases by more than 50% year on year. The Resolution Foundation's report, Food for Thought, says food prices are expected to contribute more to overall inflation than energy in the months ahead. So, William, I'm reminded reading out that item about all the recent disruption that has been caused by Brexit, the empty shelves in supermarkets, which were blamed on bad weather in Spain. So a lot of this got wrapped up with Brexit, climate change, and the war in Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world. You mentioned that earlier on. Again, just looking to try and find something about a Scottish element to this. So back in March 2022, the Scottish Government set up a food security task force jointly with the food and drinks industry. And they found that while there is greater strain on the food supply chain than there has been for many years, that immediate supplies of food and animal feed in Scotland tend to be quite secure. It's also a factor that we do need to pay farmers a fair price for their produce, don't we? So as consumers, so we're maybe going to have to be ready to pay more for our messages when we go to the shops. Do you think?
Well, yeah. See, you should, I think, look at all of these things in the round. The economy is fundamentally unbalanced at the moment. We pay far too much for our accommodation, our rent, or our mortgages, and we don't pay nearly enough for food to keep the economy really ticking over. And if some magic formula could be found to change that, we'd all be, I think, a lot happier. And I think the very poorest in society would be considerably better off than they currently are. So I think that's the real problem. It's absolutely the case that, yes, we need to pay our farmers properly. I do think that a lot of the food price rises that we're seeing now probably are knock-on effects from so many of these other factors, energy costs being one, and the other ones such as Brexit that you mentioned, and the staff shortages and the supply issues, etc., etc. They all feed through into a slightly chaotic system that means that food prices have remained higher longer than the Bank of England in all its wisdom seemed to think they would. And that is a matter of concern because it affects the worst off people who spend a greater proportion of their income on food. And the Bank of England is doing them no good at all by constantly just knocking up interest rates in the hope that that will deal with a problem that it isn't currently dealing with. So a lot of scratching heads about how to fix this one, but right now things don't look too clever.
And when you say the things don't look too clever, apparently Rishi Sunak on his way to Hiroshima was interviewed on the flight, and he said that there were two Brexit benefits. One was free sanitary products, and the other one was going to be cheaper beer. But I was struck by the fact that, well, Sunak's male, as you and I are, and he's also a teetotaler, so I'm not sure that he's qualified. But anyway, free yeah. I think the Scottish Government has shown that we didn't need to leave the EU to bring in free sanitary products, but I don't want to overrun. Is there anything else in there that you might want to say before we move on?
No, I don't think Rishi Sunak is much of an expert on anything really, and people will realise that at some point. That's really what I would be most likely to say. So yeah, feel free to move on because I think food security might be a thing we're talking about quite soon.
Yes, in fact, in the next item. So, the Rural Affairs Secretary, Mary Goujon, has written to the Prime Minister calling for detail of the announcements made by the UK government this week. Ms Goujon writes, "It is vital that we receive some more information about any funding announcements described in your letter this week to enable us to gauge the sufficiency, extent and implications of those announcements for the sector and to understand how these apply to Scottish agri-food producers and those of the other devolved governments." Ms Goujon pointed out that although the UK government holds many of the levers to help sort many of the issues impacting on food security, the Scottish Government has not received any meaningful engagement with UK ministers about this so far. Ms Goujon also observed that it was important that the Scottish Government had responded rapidly in establishing a task force and subsequently establishing a food security unit within the Scottish Government. However, she expressed her disappointment that the focus the UK Government seems to be giving to this issue now had not been in more evidence sooner. Many of the issues covered by announcements made by the UK Government to farmers this week have a significant effect on Scotland's economy and devolved matters, and Scottish ministers believe they should be able to discuss the detail with UK ministers and as a priority. So, William, you alongside my colleagues here in the studio and people that are paying attention at home might realise that I actually asked you in the previous item for the question that I was lining up for this one. I've got my notes in a fankle. But essentially, when you look at the previous item about energy bills and the cost of living crisis, and now this about food prices and UK inflation, it's as if we're in between a rock and a hard place, or in some it's a vice-like grip. I don't know. It's what do you think?
People are feeling bombarded at the moment. There's no doubt about that. Bombarded by one thing after another for the last 3 years. And there seems no end to it. And that is a problem because it almost puts you in a kind of paralysis where you can't move forward. We would love to be campaigning with people about how we could get them out of this situation. And I bet you can guess what we think the answer might start to be. But we have to speak to them in the position they're in. And the position that they're in is they're having a tough time at the moment. And yes, they need to hear that we might have possible solutions for that. But we also have to listen to them and, if you like, feel their pain to an extent and work with their pain. Because otherwise, nothing moves forward. You just have paralysis and you have surviving from day to day. And that's not a good situation for people to be in for any length of time, far less 3 or 4 years as it has been recently.
Yes, and in her letter, Marie Goujon, she's been calling for more communication between both of Scotland's governments. And yet, when we listen to things like PMQs in Westminster, the answers that come from I've got the voicemail again. I'll try and put that across during our chat about this. But we're constantly, when when opposition MPs, especially the SNP, ask any questions of ministers, we're constantly told that the Scottish government should work with Westminster government, and yet it seems that the Scottish government does call on more collaboration and more communication, but it doesn't seem to be forthcoming.
No,
Which
the
side do you?
relationship between the Scottish government and Westminster just isn't working. And of course, Westminster blames the Scottish government, and the Scottish government blames Westminster. I tend to believe the Scottish government more than Westminster, I have to say. I think there's a general contempt for not just Scotland, but Wales, and maybe even the north of England and everything outside the southeast of England. And it's almost as if a one size fits all approach to the economy is being practiced. And that doesn't work for areas like Scotland or indeed Wales, where we have our own requirements and we would benefit from a better dialogue and better working together with Westminster so that we would know the correct decisions to take and so that we'd be able to take them in a meaningful sense instead of, as we mentioned earlier, constantly mitigating. And I think it's another form of paralysis. This is a paralysis in the politics of the UK. We have parties saying that, well, you're stuck with devolution, and you should be grateful to have that. But devolution is not working if the governments don't actually work together. And if Westminster doesn't open up and give the Scottish government access to do what it was elected to do. And that is the main problem we have.
Yes, thank you, William. And just for clarification, I was trying to be ironic when I mentioned both of Scotland's governments earlier on, but and the voice in my ear pointed out that Scotland does not have two governments; it has one government, and that is the government here in Holyrood. So I'd just like to make that clarification before. Yes, so the other government, the voice in my ear again, forgive me, says is
It's
not
all
the
right, I hear
Scottish
it too.
government. It's our ears. You're right. In both of our ears, the other government is the UK's government, not Scotland's solely. So I'll move on to the next item. Hundreds of soldiers and sailors are to be trained from Monday to cover striking Border Force guards as ministers prepare for a potential summer of chaos at ports and airports. In a move that unions say will diminish security at points of entry to the UK, members of the armed forces will be given 5 days training before checking passports at Heathrow, Gatwick and Dover. Once deployed, the temporary staff in uniform will not have the powers to detain suspected drug dealers, terrorists or victims of trafficking, and will instead have to ask a fully trained Border Force staff member to do that. The training, truncated to 5 days from 3 weeks given to Border Force guards, will begin as two unions consider strike action over pay and conditions. The training follows the deployment of more than 600 soldiers, RAF staff and Royal Navy staff during strikes over the Christmas period. Soldiers in uniform worked at Gatwick, Heathrow, Birmingham, Cardiff, Manchester and Glasgow airports during the Christmas strikes. The Public and Commercial Services Union, PCS, and Immigration Service Union, ISU, which both represent Border Force guards, are considering strike action over the summer months. The Army will be deployed under the Military Aid to the Civil Authorities or MACA policy. So, William, a simple question, a quick one this time. Do you think is 5 days training going to be enough for these soldiers and sailors?
No, of course it isn't. You can't replicate 3 weeks worth of training in 5 days. You might get close-ish to it. But yes, you still need the actual Border Force staff to make things happen when it comes to stopping people getting in. The answer is just negotiate a proper settlement. This is the best that they can do. It's not that bad a solution, but our armed forces should be doing other things, and they shouldn't necessarily be wasting their time on the borders when all the government needs to do is, as with so many other industrial disputes right now, negotiate a proper settlement, understand where people are coming from when they say, we're just being told to get poorer at the minute and we won't have that. There's no reason why that should be so. You can make things work so much better and it'll work for the benefit of everybody.
So it sounds like, do you agree then that these border guards are going to be as they're just going to be decoration. They're as useful as a chocolate fire guard when it comes to protecting our borders, which we're supposed to be doing since more so since Brexit. But I was intrigued and I didn't get to the bottom of it. Maybe you know the answer. Have you any idea why there's no soldiers or sailors being sent up to protect Scottish ports this
Um,
time?
well, they were deployed at Glasgow at Christmas time. It may just be that I don't know quite how universal the strike is and how that applies in Scotland. That's not something I checked out. So um, I would imagine they would deploy them if they needed them, but maybe they've just decided to cut costs by just having them at Heathrow, Gatwick, and where was the other one? Manchester. Guessing now. So that's my short answer to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't know either. I just thought maybe you might have come across it, but we'll see. So I'll move on to the next item. Iran has executed 3 men it said were implicated in the deaths of three members of the security forces during anti-government protests, drawing condemnation from rights groups and risking further international isolation. Saleh Mirashemi, Majid Kazemi, and Sayed Yacoubi were killed this morning, the Tasnim agency reported. Crowds had gathered outside the prison where they were being held on Thursday night as rumours of their imminent execution grew. Cultural figures inside and outside Iran, as well as family members, had stepped up a campaign over the past week to halt the executions on the grounds that Iranian authorities had failed to produce definitive evidence of the men's responsibility for the deaths of 2 members of the Basij paramilitary force and a law enforcement officer on the 16th of November. Families and supporters held nightly vigils outside the Dastgerd prison in Isfahan in support of the 3 men who were being held inside. They were given a final meeting with their families on Wednesday, raising fears that their execution was imminent. Immediately after their execution on Friday, state media reran video posts of what were presented as the defendants' confessions, which Amnesty International said had been extracted by torture. At least 7 people have been hanged in relation to the protest movement that swept Iran in September, and dozens more have been sentenced to death or convicted of capital offences. So William, Iran's Supreme Court has held up this death sentence. All 3 of the men were arrested during a recent nationwide protest, and they were charged with waging war against God, a crime that's often applied to political dissidents. Legal representatives assigned to the case were consistently denied access to their clients by the court, and meanwhile, the lawyers themselves received numerous anonymous death threats for defending the 3. So my question is, do you think, was this a sham trial?
It looks very much as if it probably was, but it's not uncharacteristic of Iran's reaction to the protests that appeared last year, which has always been to take an extremely hard line and not to flinch. And it has worked for them. And I think the problem that exists is that, in fact, the hard line that Iran is taking is supported by a sufficiently large amount of the population for them to be able to get away with this. It really isn't something that we would recognize. I mean, even people who were looking at the way protesters in the UK were being treated in the last couple of weeks, and this is just another level altogether. And at the moment, I don't see anything other than this continuing. And it will eventually emasculate the protests altogether, I suspect. They've been here before and they've got through that, and they're going to get through this one. And yeah, sham trial, very likely. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of, firstly, them having any involvement in the death of the security force members that died, and then waging a war against God. That is very much a clerical charge, is it not? And that is characteristic of Iran right now, ever since 1979.
Yeah, and I think Iran's going to be one of the items that's going to be discussed at the G7. So I dare say there may be more in the headlines to come when when the results of those discussions are published. But I'll move on to the next item. Thousands of Israeli nationalists, some of them chanting racist slogans, have paraded through Jerusalem's Old City in an annual celebration day for Israelis that became one of humiliation for Palestinians living under occupation. The marchers, mostly male Orthodox teens and young men, were celebrating Israel's capture of East Jerusalem in 1967. The crowd waved blue and white Israeli flags and chanted slogans such as "Death to Arabs" and "We will burn your village." Authorities barred Palestinians from going through most of the gates into the Old City. One group of marchers threw rocks and bottles at members of the press covering the event, wounding 3 journalists, including a Palestinian reporter for Haaretz, who was struck in the neck, the paper's website reported. Police said they had arrested 2 people and described the attack as an isolated incident. Ibrahim Hamad, 28, a Palestinian freelance journalist who was covering events at Damascus Gate, said the attack was unprovoked. "We were standing here as journalists, and there were also some women wearing hijabs near us. Groups of extremist Zionists started throwing glass, bottles, and sticks," he said. Palestinian community leader Fakhri Abu Diab was outside Al-Aqsa Mosque giving a telephone interview with Israel's Enet News when 4 police officers approached him. One grabbed his phone and threw it to the ground, breaking it, he said. He was then forced out of the mosque compound, held at a street corner for an hour and a half, and told not to return to the Old City. Enet News editor Nir Cohen criticised the police behaviour. In the middle of an interview, a policeman arrives and throws his phone away just for the sake of it, with no apparent reason. A police spokesperson did not respond to a request for comment. Israel illegally annexed East Jerusalem after the 1967 war and considers it part of its eternal undivided capital. Palestinians view East Jerusalem as their future capital. The flag march reflects a far-right ideology embraced by key government ministers, including the anti-Arab extremist Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who joined the marchers. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, called the event a splendid day on which to celebrate our return to our eternal city. William, that was quite a long piece there, so I'll just ask you quickly, do you agree with Benjamin Netanyahu's sentiment?
Benjamin Netanyahu's sentiment is deeply divisive, deeply hurtful, and it's. I remember days when I was thinking that maybe in Israel-Palestine things were beginning to improve. I can think that far back, amazingly, but in recent years things have got so much out of control, and Netanyahu, to my mind, is enthralled to the far right, and he's actually giving them dog whistles in what he's saying. And I think in the end he will pay the price, because they will keep demanding and demanding and demanding and get what they want. And the society, already deeply divided, will become impossible to sustain. And I really do fear a bloodbath in Israel-Palestine as things currently stand. And today's events show nothing that would make me differ from that viewpoint.
Do you think that Israel can be viewed as a democracy when you see how journalists are being treated, never mind Palestinian civilians?
Well, democracy is under threat everywhere, and nowhere is it more under threat, I suspect, in places such as Israel. As soon as if you've got journalists who are properly holding governments to account, and the governments hit back at those journalists, that is a problem wherever it happens. It may have been an isolated incident, but it just isn't good enough. And certainly Benjamin Netanyahu should be alluding to it with a hint of regret, rather than just triumphalizing about what a great day it's been for his side of the argument. So I hesitate to accuse any country of not being a democracy, because you just never know what's going to happen in any corner of the world. But all I would say is reiterate that democracy is under threat, and we will miss it once it's gone.
Thank you, William. So the next item is the BBC Question Time presenter, Fiona Bruce, has come in for criticism again following the latest visit of the programme to Scotland. Whether it was intentional to break the flow of the speaker or simply her lack of understanding of Scotland and Scottish politics, Ms Bruce continually interrupted speakers and in particular the SNP's Mary McCallan, who was interrupted 14 times. Commenting on the programme, an SNP spokesperson said, despite the chair's continual interruptions, Mary was head and shoulders above the other BBC Question Time panellists, highlighting the great many reasons to vote SNP to protect Scotland from the worst of Westminster's cost of living crisis and making the positive case for Scottish independence. On Twitter, the SNP's deputy leader, Keith Brown, said, Mary McCallan's explaining superbly the anti-democratic nature of the UK, what Scotland needs to do to escape it, and all while dealing with constant interruption from Fiona Bruce. Meanwhile, in London, the BBC has asked writer Samir Shah, who contributed to the government's controversial Sewell report on race relations, to report on whether the BBC is impartial in its coverage of people crossing the channel in small boats. So, William, did you see the show last night?
I did not, because I deliberately avoid it and have done for many years. I watched once a show when it was recorded in Perth, and that was actually tolerably balanced. But all too often, it's just one-way traffic with the independent side of things being outnumbered almost invariably. And yeah, a tendency to interrupt people, not just Mary McCallan, but she suffered from it, I think, more than anybody else. And the clips that I have subsequently watched, because I was doing my prep for this, indicate that it really isn't possible to put forward your argument in any coherent way when somebody is nipping at your heels in the way that Fiona Bruce does. And Fiona Bruce is palpably worse at that than many of her predecessors, who at least gave the folk some chance to put their side of the argument. I thought she held up reasonably well. The real lesson from the clips I saw was that Alex Salmons knows how to take care of himself, and there's a lot that many politicians could learn from him about putting your point of view across. I know he's not exactly flavour of the month right now in all corners of the independence movement, but watch what he does well and learn from it if you possibly can.
Yes, and did you happen to see any clips of Fiona Bruce's opening remarks at the start of the show before the title music comes on?
She seemed to decide that the SNP had gone spectacularly off the rails, which seems to be commenting rather heavily on perhaps legal proceedings that might or might not be going on. Who can say? Certainly, it could just about perhaps nudge members of the jury, a putative jury in the future, into thinking in ways that really she shouldn't be nudging them to think about. So that was careless. And it was almost the contempt that the broadcasting establishment feels for Scotland is almost as if justice isn't quite as important here as it is in other parts of the UK. So yeah, that was way, way out of line. The SNP doesn't have its problems to seek, that's for sure. But you have to give them a chance as participants in the programme, and you certainly don't want to be bad-mouthing them right at the start and framing the entire narrative for the rest of the show.
Yeah, Jerry Hassan tweeted, and again, I'm trying to remember the actual content of the tweet, but my favourite social media comment on Bruce's opening was, let's have a general election tomorrow and see which party has come off the rails. And so that made me smile. I shouldn't give too much away there. I'm supposed to be impartial. But certainly one thing that you mentioned, that guests rarely seem to be given time to finish a sentence when they're on Question Time. Here at Broadcasting Scotland, we actually pride ourselves on letting people speak without interruption. I think sometimes maybe people like myself talk too much, which gets in the way of you getting time.
Sometimes people like me talk too much. I bet you regret that sometimes.
No, not at all. No, we relish everybody's contributions here. But William, I'm just going to ask you the very same first question that came from the audience in question time
Hmm.
last night and see what you have to say. So the first question was, are opposition parties being overly confident about the supposed demise of the SNP without themselves offering an alternative?
I think they are possibly overconfident because, um, one, be careful what you wish for, because if the SNP does get into trouble, it may well be supplanted by another independence party that the unionist politicians won't like either. But also, don't over-egg your own popularity with the electorate, because I think that may prove to be a mirage in the end. So, third thing, they are not offering an alternative. I actually would like to hear what is the unionist narrative? What are these political parties' narrative for Scotland and how it can do better? What's their vision of Scotland? We never hear it. So, yeah, on all three counts, I think I would tend to agree with the question that, yeah, they're culpable on the lot.
Thanks, William. That the person that seemed, if I remember rightly, the person that got most time to answer for that question was Jackie Bailey. And again, I saw some social media comments go by. I think that might have been Jerry Hassan's, where he pointed out that there were some inaccuracies in her answer, or answers even. But you talked about Scotland doing better, and that did become a theme for Mr. Offord. I can't remember his first name.
Malcolm.
Malcolm Offord. Thank you, William.
Oh, sorry, Lord. I
Lord,
forgot. It's
Lord.
Lord.
It's all due reverence where it's due. Being ironic again there. Femi, a major figure on Twitter, Femi Sorry, picked up on Lord Offord's colonial attitude in one of his tweets, and Femi's not even Scottish; he's English. He said, calling it a generous devolution settlement shows you think you own Scotland. And when it comes to Scotland doing better, Offord said the UK government believes Scotland can and should be the most prosperous part of the UK outside London. It has all the tools to do that. And yet, we're not the most prosperous part of the UK outside London, are we? Why do you think that is?
We're not actually doing badly outside London in the southeast, although we're always talked down. But it depends what you mean by prosperity and who's getting the prosperity and what sort of society have you got. We'll be hearing a lot more in future times, I hope, about the well-being economy. And a well-being economy right now, Scotland ain't. And certainly the UK ain't either, but Scotland has the possibility of being the well-being economy. Malcolm Offord got his reward for founding the No Borders organisation that was Gavin Esler's great sting, his coup, his scoop, if you like, during the referendum when he went to watch this group of basically folk singers singing about how wonderful it was to have just no borders anywhere and why we shouldn't impose them. And this was taken to be a popular grassroots uprising, whereas it was just sheer astroturfing. Offord was behind that. He got his reward, and now he's in a better position than many people who've been elected and lording it over us. So, yeah, a colonial attitude. And I thought some very old-fashioned attitudes to democracy as well were coming from, and of course, spinning out that Alex Salmond obiter dictum as once in a lifetime. And I'll correct that back to generation and stripping of it as original meaning. Just very uninspired, I thought, because they've been doing that for years and it doesn't wash.
Yeah, and uh, another point that Lord Offord made, he was actually quite generous when he admitted or agreed that Scotland, in terms of its whisky and salmon production, accounts for way more than 8% of, Scotland's 8% of the UK's population, but salmon and whisky is a huge percentage of the UK's entire food and drink export. And I think he then went on to Lord Frost was brought into the mix. And correct me if I'm wrong, Lord Frost he was connected to the Scottish whisky industry,
The
yes.
Scottish Whisky Association, I think,
Yeah, and offered
or something very like it.
yes, and offered in his answer said, I don't know if Lord Frost has ever been to Scotland. He said, but I live here and I know what it's like. And Alex Salmond likewise said he didn't know if Frost had ever been to Scotland, but surely he must have been to Scotland at some point if he was in charge of the whisky industry.
You would think so, but you might be surprised. I would have to check my references for that one,
Yeah,
I'm afraid.
likewise. And again, I'm struggling to remember why Frost came into the conversation on the show. But oh, that's right. It was, he said that the voice in our ear has reminded us that Frost said that he wanted devolution in Scotland rolled back, and Offord said, well, he didn't agree with that because he lives in Scotland and he knows what Scotland's like. Does that?
Yeah. A lot of politicians were quite quick to say they didn't like the sound of that much. But then they have the conundrum that they have to justify devolution and the way it's working. And that's what we should press them more to do.
Yes. Well, we've got a wee bit of time, and we've covered the running order. Is there anything in tonight's show that you wanted to say that didn't get a chance to say it about previous items?
No, I've been speaking out of turn all along, so there's not really much more. I thought it was a very interesting, for a quiet day, and it has been a quiet day. I thought it was an interesting set of stories, and it was nice to finish with a wee romp. Admittedly, a program I didn't watch, and I've only watched in clips, but I question time is a questionable time, for sure, absolutely for sure.
Well, thank you. Sorry, what was that? Apologies, viewers. We're listening to the voice in our ear. William, is there anything that you would want to say in response to that whispering voice?
I didn't watch enough of the show to be able to comment,
Yeah.
but if something involved.
Okay. So I've been asked to go to the last paragraph of the previous story.
Let's go.
Meanwhile, in London, the BBC has asked
That's it.
writer Samir Shah, who contributed to the government's controversial Sewell report on race relations, to report on whether the BBC is impartial in its coverage of people crossing the channel in small boats.
Gotcha. Yeah. I don't think the BBC is entirely impartial, but it does try to be impartial, but it constantly sees the people coming in boats as the problem, whereas the problem is the system that forces them into the boats.
Do you think the recent figures who were put in place controversially by Boris Johnson, I think they've gone now, haven't they? Do you think that will make things better when it comes to BBC and impartiality?
BBC always has a way of messing up its impartiality somewhere along the lines. It might do, but I will not hold my breath.
Yes, and if, like me, you follow MSM Monitor on Twitter, then there's plenty of examples for BBC Scotland to furnish any discussions about BBC impartiality. Well,
definitely.
So I think we're now almost ready to finish the hour. So, William, thank you again with your patience for your patience with me, and for sharing your thoughts and views.
Oh, thank you for the roller coaster ride.
I'll try to be a bit smoother next time. So we'll see you again sometime. Thank you, William.
Okay.
Well, that's it for this evening. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff and to make more programmes. But that's about it for tonight, so thank you for watching, and it'll be me in the hot seat again on Sunday with your full Scottish, so I hope to see you then. Good night.